The Russian army has unleashed a real massacre of Ukrainian equipment in the Kursk region. The days of Sudzha are numbered. Today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of February 9, 2025. A tremendous number of events have occurred today, so let's dive right in. We'll start with the Sudzha salient, from where the majority of objective control footage and various events are being reported. If we look at the map, the entire Sudzha direction can be divided into three sectors based on the concentration of events. The first sector is the Anulan sector, where the armed forces of Ukraine, AFU, are attempting to attack to gain control of several settlements and push Russian units away from key supply routes. The next concentration of geolocations comes from the Sverdlikova and Lebedevka line, which we will discuss in a few minutes. The third concentration of geolocations comes from the N07 highway, where we see a large number of strikes on the main supply artery for the AFU grouping in the Sudzha district. Now let's start in order. We'll begin with the Anulan direction, where the AFU, after 4 days of combat, has failed to achieve any significant results. The fighting in the Ulanok settlement resembles the battles we observed in the Rabatino area, where, at the cost of heavy losses in Western equipment and personnel, the Ukrainian side managed to enter the Rabatino settlement for about a year. However, by mid to late 2024, the AFU had abandoned the settlement. Over the past few days, we've seen a massive amount of geolocation footage showing the Ukrainian side losing dozens of pieces of equipment, including engineering vehicles, armored vehicles, tanks, and other Western-provided hardware. Interestingly, Western countries had spent months gathering and delivering this equipment to Ukraine through various secret and non-secret channels, only for it to be destroyed in just 4 days of combat. Clearly, someone miscalculated in planning the operation in the southeastern part of the Sudzha district. This miscalculation was fatal, and it seems the Ukrainian command is now realizing what has happened and what to expect in the near future. Despite the losses and problems on this front, the Ukrainian side has decided to redeploy everything possible to stabilize the front line and prevent any counterattacks by the Russian army. After suffering these losses and what amounts to a defeat, the Russian army could potentially push back toward Sudzha, at least toward the Makhnovka settlement. To this end, everything that can be moved is being sent toward Sudzha. The Russian command has taken advantage of this situation, establishing complete fire control over the N07 highway. A large video has surfaced online showing numerous episodes of Ukrainian equipment being destroyed, indicating that the N07 highway is under full fire control. The AFU is suffering catastrophic losses, and if, for example, 100 units are sent towards Sudzha, it's unclear how many will actually make it. Serious problems are also brewing on the Sverdlikova-Lebedevka line. Over the past few days, the Russian army has repeatedly attempted to gather a critical mass in the Lebedevka area, bringing in personnel and occupying forest belts, likely in preparation for a possible offensive toward the settlement. However, the Ukrainian side, particularly the 47th Brigade, has published a significant amount of footage showing strikes with cluster munitions and artillery on Russian forward positions. It's unclear what's happening in Lebedevka, but if we're talking about the Russian side, it's likely that on the night of February 9th to 10th, 2025, the Russian army will launch a decisive assault on these two settlements to break through the AFU's defenses. On this sector of the front, pro-Russian mapping services have already made numerous adjustments to the front line. For example, Russian experts claim that the Russian army has already entered the southwestern part of Sverdlikova and expanded its control in the northern part. If Russian forces, after inflicting a critical defeat in the Ulanok direction, manage to consolidate in Lebedevka and Sverdlikova, this would effectively mark the beginning of combat operations for Sudzha itself and the Sudzha agglomeration. This would reduce the distance to the main supply route to a minimum, after which negotiations would likely begin on how the Ukrainian side could withdraw its units with minimal losses. We'll have to wait and see how this situation develops. Next, we move to the North Kupiansk direction, where the Russian armed forces are no longer just expanding their bridgehead in the Dvyrekhnoi settlement on the Ukrainian side of the Oskol River, but are likely launching a full-scale offensive between the two AFU defensive lines on the Kharkiv front. Over the past day, several geolocations have been published, confirming the Russian army's advance. In footage released by the Ukrainian side, we can see FPV drone strikes on Russian forward positions along the Dvorechneia road toward the Zakidne settlement. Based on this footage, we've marked the disputed territory as under Russian control. Additionally, both pro-Russian and neutral mapping services note that the Russian army has advanced significantly westward toward the Monoshevka settlement. We see daily geolocation updates from this sector, indicating that the AFU is generally unable to stabilize the situation here. Or perhaps stabilizing it is not currently a priority, as it would require additional resources. Next, we move to the Lyman or Siversk-Lyman direction, where very important footage is coming in. Today it appears that a company stronghold in the eastern part of the Verkhnekamenskoye settlement has been completely cleared and taken under full control by Russian forces. This stronghold had been a significant thorn in the side of Russian troops, who had repeatedly attempted to storm this sector since 2022 without success. Only now, in early February, has the Russian army finally taken full control of this area. Recall that at the end of January, there were reports of Russian forces entering the eastern part of Verkhnekamenskoye, cutting off the AFU grouping in the northeastern part of the supply stronghold. After a few days of what could be described as a small famine, the Russian army launched a decisive assault, and the stronghold fell. This effectively collapsed the main defensive line on the eastern Siversk direction. Russian units are now gradually advancing toward the western part of Verkhnekamenskoye, potentially encircling Ukrainian units in Serebryanka and Grigorovka, after which combat operations for Siversk itself may begin. Overall, despite the Russian army's advance toward Pokrovsk and the problems in the Kursk region's Sudzha salient, as well as the decisive progress in the Kupiansk direction, 2025 seems to be shaping up as the year of Siversk and Sloviansk. This sector of the front has become particularly active, starting with the advance on Verkhnekamenskoye and the expansion of the bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of the Jerebets River. Additionally, the Russian Ministry of Defense recently reported that the Orakovo-Vasilivka settlement has been cleared and taken under full control by Russian forces, further indicating a westward push towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Next, we move to the Chasiv Yar area, where footage from the central part has largely stopped being published. Most of the footage now shows Russian artillery and MLRS strikes on AFU positions west of the settlement. It seems that Chasiv Yar has already come under Russian control, but both sides are maintaining some level of information hygiene, avoiding premature disclosures. We then move to the Toretsk direction, where the map has seen no changes in the past day. Recall that the Russian Ministry of Defense recently announced the complete clearing of this settlement. Currently, regrouping and resupply are underway, possibly including some rest. The main task is to prepare for an offensive toward Andriivka, which will likely begin once Chasiv Yar fully falls under Russian control. Next, we move to the Pokrovsk or Dnipro direction, where the Russian army is gradually advancing toward the regional border. Over the past day, significant progress has been made west of the Novovasilivka settlement. Pro-Russian experts note full control over the Uspenivka settlement and the beginning of combat operations for the Novoalexandriivka settlement, with attacks coming from both the southeast and east. Additionally, Russian forces have advanced in the Nadezhdenka settlement, with several forest belts coming under Russian control. There also appears to be a collapse of AFU defenses in the eastern part of Zaporizhzhia. According to various mapping services, the Russian army has made minor advances westward. The Ukrainian side is throwing significant personnel and equipment into stabilizing the front line and preventing Russian forces from entering the Dnipropetrovsk region. However, it seems that the resources being deployed are insufficient to slow down the Russian advance. The only tactic that somewhat helps the Ukrainian side slow the Russian advance is the use of harassing strikes from the Pokrovsk area. Today, footage continued to emerge of combat operations in the Kotlina settlement. While the Russian army moves westward toward the border, Ukrainian units from Pokrovsk are striking their rear, naturally slowing the Russian advance. Today, footage of a successful Ukrainian counter-offensive toward the Pishchain settlement was also published. During the fighting, the Ukrainian side managed to take control of a construction site. In the footage, we can see a Russian drone flying over the area, searching for Ukrainian soldiers attempting to hold their positions. This seems to be slightly slowing the Russian advance. It has also become known that Ukraine has deployed its best general, most combat-ready units, and top FPV operators to this direction. Finally, we move to the Andriivka fortified area, where very important footage is coming in. Today, according to both pro-Ukrainian and neutral mapping services, the Russian armed forces have taken control of over 50% of the Andriivka settlement. Just yesterday, we observed a certain map, but today advances are being made in the central part. The pace here is quite rapid. If we're talking about Andriivka, the advance is very swift. In fact, the speed of the advance on Andriivka may rival that of the advance on Velika Novosilka, which has been under combat since 2022. In just 4 days, over 55% of this fortified area has come under Russian control. By the end of February 5th, we saw a breakthrough in the central part on February 6th, followed by an expansion of the control zone on February 7th. By February 8th, over 40% of the settlement was under Russian control, with the eastern part collapsing. By February 9th, we see rapid advances toward the northern and northwestern outskirts of the settlement. At this rate, within 5 to 6 days, the entire Andriivka will come under Russian control, and the Russian army will be able to establish full fire control over the Constantinople-Ulakli road. Strongholds west of Dakhny will likely be abandoned or fully encircled. Interesting footage is also emerging from south of Rozliv. Today, pro-Ukrainian services published footage of FPV drone strikes on Russian saboteurs attempting to advance toward the settlement. Recall that we discussed how, to fully close the pocket between Constantinople and Ulakli, the Russian army needs to attack toward Rozliv to cut the road between the Bohatyr and Constantinople settlements. If this operation succeeds, it will create a pocket with no chance of evacuation.